Okay, here I am back again, and this will be the last part of the course. This will be the material that we'll cover from here on to your final. Where I'm at is chapter 13, which is the part of your text on North and South America, Native American culture, parallel to the times that we've just gone through here. And then the next chapter will go to the savanna kingdoms of Africa. It covers a broad range of cultures, concepts, etc. And these two chapters will be the source of your identifications for your final, Native America and Africa. It will also be part of one of your essay questions in terms of how they were impacted by the Age of Discovery, and I'll give you the specifics of that when we arrive at that particular point. Now, what I have here on the document camera, I've had this up here before, but this traces, the African genesis, the emergence of modern human beings here in the Lakes region of Africa 100,000 years ago, and then that migration out north, west. There's a migration across the peninsula into Europe, across Asia, Southeast Asia, even the islands, and up here into Siberia. And then over here you see the path down here into the Americas. Now, I guess I'll go put it up on the board. The way Native Americans got here was across a land bridge called Beringia. It's called Beringia because it once covered what is now called the Bering Sea. And I've got a couple images of that I wanted to show you. But this depicts here on this computer graphic the Ice Age, the last great Ice Age. There have been several. This shows the Ice Age coming down from the Arctic time period. Didn't have any worries about global warming at that particular point. And while you had this giant sheet of ice here, there were areas that were either above or not covered by the ice, etc., by which groups could work their way down into the Americas. The thing about this, and this is the difficulty about the oldest Native American history, is that, again, there aren't written records, and in many cases there really isn't artifacts, because it's just as likely that you got a seaborne arrival here. The oceans were much smaller, much shallower here, and you probably had fishing communities that gradually migrated following the fish like fishermen do, and actually arriving via a coastal destination as well. That's an hypothesis, and it's really almost an unprovable one in any tangible way, because as the glaciers melted, global warming at a different time, the sea level came up, and all the evidence of civilizations were wiped out. Were destroyed. Oceans, as they rise with storms, etc., artifacts just simply get decimated, and there really isn't even an architectural record that can be followed, archaeological record that can be followed from that particular time period. Just like to point out, here we are today, as you either at Lorraine High and me here over at LCC. This is where we are. We would be at the bottom of a mile thick, at least, sheet of ice from the glacier coming down to the North Pole. We are among the furthest southern destinations or places where the glacier arrived. It's kind of surprising, kind of follows the turnpike. If you go south of the turnpike onto Medina County, you'll notice the rivers flow south instead of north. And that's due to the pressure and drift of the glaciers itself. The rivers that go north are very, very old and predate the formation of the glaciers. It did change the course of the Allegheny and the Missouri rivers, creating that big, gigantic Mississippi river system that is one of the great assets of the United States today. And of course, as the glacier receded in fits and starts, we got the Great Lakes. And again, here our ridge roads, North Ridge, Center Ridge, Middle Ridge, etc., are all at one time what was the shores of Lake Erie as the glacier receded downward. If you go on any of the ridge roads, just if you look north, it's about 20 or 30 feet lower than if you look south, and that's just from the pressure of the glacier and where the coast of the lake was at any given time. So I thought this was a good graphic to show you on Beringia. And then I like to do this one because it gives you a really good idea. It's about 1,200 miles across Beringia, and this is the way it looked. Well, I don't want to do that. What's going on here? Okay. Usually this is interactive, and it'll show the... Oh, here you go. Up here it shows you the years. And you see here the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea is, this is 21,000 years ago. This is all land, 19,000 years ago, etc. And quite frankly, there's no real evidence that that was the limit of it. It could have been smaller, but more likely in my mind, it was probably larger, allowing for the passage. And then here you see the split. And at this point, traffic back and forth across that area of sea does not take place. It's not all that far across. So to a certain extent, it's surprising that there wasn't continued migration. But as we know, it's very, very cold up there. And it's time to bring this point across. Prehistoric people were pretty healthy, not a lot of disease, etc. And when this passage came, as they crossed the very cold areas up here, extreme cold is as destructive to harmful bacteria, germs as we call them, as is extreme heat. And you probably had in this group of people who came across Beringia, one of the healthiest populations in the history of the world. What happened here? Crossed out something I didn't want to cross out. Well, I'll just type it in again. Here's another hypothetical that Beringia could have been even this large, which I think is just as likely as anything else. And then this is the area as it looks now, and I guess this is the little place here where Sarah Palin's house is, and she can see Russia. She never really said that. That was a Tina Fey joke on Saturday Night Live, but it's one of those things that has taken on a life of its own. So, I did that little aside there about the crossing over, about the passage of Native Americans across Beringia here into North America, and then the melting of the polar glacier. Now, when we were talking about the Black Plague, the bubonic plague in Europe, the reason that it decimated Europe is it originated here in this part of the world. And the plagues had taken place centuries, maybe even a millennia earlier, wiping out these populations, leaving behind a population with immunities. During the Crusades, trade increased from this area, came into Europe, and it ran into, as it attached itself, the plague, to rats, to which fleas had attached themselves, to which the bacteria had attached themselves, and wiped out 30 to 40% of the population of Europe. The survivors had immunities, passed them on to the children, and nobody dies of the bubonic plague, or almost nobody dies of bubonic plague in the modern world. Well, this sort of thing had gone on. Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Asia, etc., for thousands of years, with the survivors reproducing and passing on immunities. Well, meanwhile, back at the ranch here in the Americas, they didn't experience any of those plagues, and therefore never developed any immunities to the diseases. that had transpired. And when and it didn't matter who arrived, whether it was Europeans, Asians, Africans, whoever arrived, the fate of Native Americans was going to be the same. Here are a couple amazing stats because of that 10,000 year separation. If you are European or Asian, your chances of not having an immunity to a particular disease is 3 in 100, about 3%. And if you're African, it's even better. You have about a 2% chance of not having an immunity to a particular disease. The difference being like yellow fever, malaria. Nobody has an immunity to encephalitis from the tsetse flies, but you can get vaccinated for that. So you have that. If you're Native American, that 10,000 year separation means you've got about a 33% chance not of getting sick, of not having an immunity to a particular disease. As the very unhealthy populations that came across on cramped ships, which were very conducive to the formation of bacteria, disease, etc., and landed in the Americas with devastating results. Here's an amazing statistics, and if you're interested in this sort of thing, an interesting book on it is, it's called 1491, which is symbolic in that it is 1 year before the arrival of Columbus. His theory is and he backs it up with scientific investigation, was that there were 100 million Native Americans that were here when Columbus arrived. The entire population of Europe at that time was only 80 million. So without disease, the entire history of that period would be very, very different because the European population and the resources they had would not have allowed them to move in and take over in the way that they did. Now, it wasn't an immediate takeover, etc., but it was a steady takeover over the course of about 300 years where that took place. But that's a stunning statistic. By 1600, a century later, the native population was only 10 million. Now this is interesting. It's always interesting for me because when I was a young student like yourselves, that happened once upon a time, the consensus was there was, maybe total 10 to 20 million Native Americans populating the Americas at European arrival. But that was really only after like the English and French arrival, which occurred a century after the first contacts that occurred. And the number one thing that allowed for the European takeover was disease and the lack of immunity to disease. To be sure, there was fighting, genocide, mayhem, etc. But the weaponry of the time would not have allowed 90 million people to have been killed either with swords or cannons or guns. They just didn't have the technology to do that. Second of all, that was not their intent to kill all the Native Americans. Their intent was to use them as labor as they had used serfs on the medieval manors. But that didn't quite work out so well. Obviously, as Native Americans they either did not survive or they took off into the interior away from where Europeans were. In either case, they were not available most as a labor source. And what I'll get to when I discuss the next chapter is they still needed a labor force. And where did they turn? Is since they no longer had a labor force here in the Americas, Europeans, nor could they convince any large number of Europeans to leave and come to this strange place, you ended up with African slave labor. And I'll talk about that when I get into the next chapter there. But The Age of Discovery, which we'll get to after these two chapters, is just one of those explosive things where three different cultures that had never been together butt up right against one another and create a very explosive, dynamic new history in the world. But as I said, that's a couple chapters down the road. This is a map here of what's called Mesoamerica, and I'll go to that on the computer next. And this is the area that's known as Mesoamerica. It's called Central America for the most part today, and then the rest of Central America down here. North America is up this way. South America is down this way. This little narrow strip from southern Mexico and northern Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica. This is the heartland, the Native American heartland of Mesoamerica. And Meso means in between. It's in between North and South America. The thing about it is that's where the bulk of population of Native Americans lived at the time of arrival. And it's the same thing as Southeast Asia, southern China, even southern Mesopotamia. There's such an advantageous supply of water and a continuous source of warmth and heat for growing that you could get 2 whole crops in an entire calendar year. This allows you once again to produce a food surplus, and as we talked about in the ancient historical world, once you produced a food surplus, you produced civilization. And the agricultural revolution that took place in the ancient historical world in Mesopotamia, about 10,000 BCE, was discovered and developed independently in the Americas probably about 5,000 years later. But the interesting thing is, in terms of civilization and development, it evolved and developed in much the same way. Certainly with distinctive cultural patterns, etc. But I'll go to the document camera here. And this is, I'm going to go through a couple books and photos. And the point I try to make here is that, and this is the book here, Aztec and Maya, and this is the cover, and could be a little, it's kind of dull. But what you see here is a very, very sophisticated culture with complex buildings, complex rituals, etc. And interestingly enough, as you see here, you have the pyramid, okay, which is associated so often with Egypt. Now the difference here is these are step pyramids, and they're step pyramids because they had a different function. They were temples. They were more like the buildings in Mesopotamia. The large, tall buildings that they were built in Sumer and so on, that were religious sites where they went and studied their astronomy, etc., but also were points of observation. They're more like these pyramids are more like that, is that they were religious in nature. And the point I try to make is that this was not a culture. This was not a series of cultures like a John Wayne movie. Where you got the cavalry with guns and uniforms and horses, and bare-chested Native Americans running around throwing spears and bows and arrows. To be sure, they didn't have guns and that sort of thing, but they were very, very sophisticated and developed cultures. And one of the things that happened, many of these are in the areas settled by the Spanish. And the Spanish, as did the Christians in the Middle East and in Greece, destroyed a lot of the pagan images, buildings, and so on because they wanted to Christianize the population. And not only did European culture spread to the Americas because of their ability to get here, they also brought Christianity with them. And it's at this point where Christianity spreads and becomes a larger religion numerically than their chief rival, Islam, at that time. But you can see this is a very sophisticated layout here. Steps to a building, courtyard, palace, etc. Okay, this pyramid, I guess not so clear. There you go. This pyramid here, very, very steep. It was meant to mimic a nearby mountain. And it's kind of amazing. I don't know how you get up those steps, but they did. And you can see it takes a lot of organization and skill to create something like that. This is one of the oldest of the Mesoamerican cities, Monte Alban. Again, these are ruins. Some of these were destroyed before the arrival of the Spanish. Many were destroyed by the Spanish. And the other thing is, more and more of these are being uncovered because the jungle has covered them up. In every place they thought there was a little hill, they're finding out that it was a city with large buildings. Now this one clearly is not in the jungle. It's in a mountain area up high in a dry, arid kind of climate. Okay, again here's another small pyramid down here at the bottom. And then up here is the gigantic Pyramid of the Moon that was created in Tenochtitlan. And it was, its counterpart across the way was the Pyramid of the Sun. Here is a very, very elaborate palace. Architecturally amazing that you could build it that high, and then the decoration and so on is quite substantial. Here, these are monuments to soldiers, big statues, 10, 15 feet high, passed up as monuments to the to soldiers, which were held in high regard and high esteem in that particular culture. Again, here's another row of soldiers. Here are some paintings. Trying to think what I was looking for here. I'm not quite sure. So I'll just flip the page. This is what I wanted to get to. This is called a codex. C-O-D-E-X. It's kind of like a book. And there's not many of these that survived. Again, when the Spanish came, they saw this as pagan imagery, etc. And so they destroyed a lot of it. And that destruction, much of the history of the Maya, the Aztecs, all the peoples that had gone before them were destroyed by the Spanish intentionally. And it's just, one of those things that as historians just go, why did you do that? But now we have to piece it together in a different way. Again, here is a grand palace of one of the rulers there. You can see it's pretty monumental in terms of architecture. And I'll get to this. This is a basketball court. Not really. It was some kind of a ball game, and the ball was rubber. Okay, that was one of the New World findings when the Europeans arrived, that there was such a thing as rubber. But obviously, the rubber ball was solid. They didn't have valve and an air pump to pump it in there. It was a solid rubber ball, and this is the length of one. Here's a drawing of what the ball court looked like, and then you had these hoops that were on the side, but instead of being horizontal, they were vertical, and you had to try to get the ball through the hoop without using your hand. You could use anything else, and you wore pads. There were no fouls in this particular game of basketball, which could be quite brutal. Here, I picked this one because it's a little cartoonish drawing, but the Mayans in particular, and Mesoamerica in general, they were big on body piercings. And they didn't do the body piercings for dress or design. It was done deliberately to make themselves bleed, because one of their religious beliefs is their gods needed blood. They needed to drink blood in order to survive, so they would regularly make themselves bleed and then bring that to their gods so their gods could drink their blood and then bring whatever good fortune they could bring to them. But they didn't do the simple little piercings. They had the big, huge ones all the way through both nostrils. Sometimes they would pierce. They would take a sharp piece of bone, put it through their cheek, and then come down through their lip and out the other side, and do it in that way. And they would pierce various and sundry other body parts, and the whole idea of that was the way of honoring their gods and solving the needs of their gods. And then what I have here, and this is where they really ran into conflict with the Spanish. This is what the pyramids were for, those step pyramids, is you took a person up to the top of that pyramid. And I always wondered, how the heck did you get somebody that knew they were about to be killed up that pyramid? Evidently, they drugged them. They mescaline or something where they were out of consciousness. They would take them up to the top. And then you have these assistants here. One grabs this arm, leg, and you're bent over backwards over this stone. And then here is the priest. And what the priest does, whoops, I better get back to the document camera. There it is, yep. What the priest does is he has a very sharp obsidian knife made out of volcanic stone, and he makes 4 cuts, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he reaches into your chest, snatches your heart out, and then tosses it over. The assistant catches the heart and then puts it up on the altar, and then these folks throw the body off the side of the pyramid. And this is repeated depending on how much intercession they're looking for on behalf of themselves with their gods. This is how they proceed apace with their ceremonies, etc. Here's another. This one is this is a big basketball court. The fans would sit up here on the side, and then the game would go on there. Here's another shot down here of the basketball court. Again, it's a ball game, not a court, not basketball, but it was a rubber ball. And depending on what was the case, sometimes in these ritual games, if you lost, you went up to the top of the pyramid and were sacrificed. Other times, however, the winning team might be sacrificed because you wanted to offer your best up to your gods, and therefore the winners would be sacrificed rather than just the losers. And then again, here's another big architectural rendering from Monte Alban there. But the point I'm making is that these were not, savage cultures with a few buildings here and there. These were elaborate civilizations that evolved and developed, in some cases bizarrely, on their own, and were every bit as sophisticated as the cultures that they encountered. Their biggest problem was the lack of immunity to European diseases, and then of course they didn't have the weaponry. But the weaponry wouldn't have been a factor had the numbers not been decimated by disease, because they could have out-tacticked the Europeans and certainly outnumbered and overwhelmed them at any given point. But within 100 years, that was no longer possible due to the ravages of disease that occurred. So I'm going to go in kind of quick order here, the various cultures that we're going to see. And as I said, these are the chapters where your terms are going to come from. Yeah, this is not what I wanted. I wanted to I might have to just type them in individually. We'll do that. Let's start out here with the Olmecs. These are some Some of the artwork from the Olmecs, again, artwork occurs in periods of peace and prosperity. Now this is a head. This head is about 12 feet high. So these are monumental works of art. They're not some simple little statue that was carved and is indicative of a culture that is sophisticated and technologically adept. Here's another statue of what's called a wrestler. And then I like this. This is a jade mask that's carved. And masks are common to cultures, polytheistic cultures across the world. And personally I like these various masks from these third world countries. I find them interesting, and I've got several myself. Okay, this is where the Olmecs are. They're along the Gulf Coast right here, southeast Mexico, right in here in between this is the Yucatan Peninsula, which is the home of another Mesoamerican culture. But these are the various cities that are developed by the Olmecs. And the term Olmecs, it's a historical term for Old Mexican or oldest Mexican, because they're the oldest sophisticated culture that's been documented. And again, they're right in here. This is the Olmec culture, and then there's some filtering into other ways. But it appears to be the mother culture, the one that creates it's kind of like Sumer, where the cultures that follow change and alter it, but they build upon the base that was put together there. Okay, next, go to Monte Alban. Monte Alban tequila. Funny. Okay, here's some photos here of Monte Alban. Oh, there's a whole bunch of them here. Guess I'll go to this one. Again, a very sophisticated culture. I think we had a different view of this in one of the pictures in the book I showed you. Let's see if there's anything that's distinctly different here. Pretty similar to what we've already seen, so I won't dwell on that. Monte Alban was adjacent to the Olmec culture. It's further inland and it's into the mountains. If you see here, this is kind of a coastal plain, low-lying coastal plain, lots of small rivers, land for fertilization, etc. Monte Alban is back higher up, where the farming is a little more difficult, but again, produced this very sophisticated culture. Now here's another term, pre-Columbian, that you'll see, and that's pretty self-explanatory. And then all this data I have up here is pre-Columbian. And that simply means before Columbus. Okay, and that's where the title of the book 1491 comes from. And then that is a very readable book, and I would recommend it to any student. And it really, for me, really changed a lot of my perceptions about Native American history before the arrival of Europeans. There is, by the same author, another book, 1493, and it's a little more speculative. It doesn't, it's not quite as well documented, but it is well documented and footnoted. It would be completely acceptable for a book review. But it's a little more speculative about what happened after Columbus and why. Both, I would say, if you have interest in American history, particularly pre-Columbian, it's a must-read in both cases. So here you have Monte Alban in this pre-Columbian area. It's located in the low mountainous area just above the central plain of the valley below it. It's partially excavated, and it's on top of an artificially leveled ridge. In other words, they cut off the top of the mountain in order to level it out and build all these sorts of things. It appears to be one of the earliest cities in Mesoamerica, and kind of was probably a center of religious culture, a religious center where various groups came to offer sacrifice, worship, etc., because it was higher up in the mountains. And this is a pretty impressive place here. This is Teotihuacan. And look at this, this road leading down the center, pyramid, giant pyramid on the side, all these smaller buildings, etc. This is, on the level of Egyptian culture, in that you make these monumental buildings, and they're all built by hand, without power tools, without metal tools, for all that matter, to be done. So these are not, again, the Apaches running around attacking John Wayne in the Hollywood movie. Whoops, I didn't even have it on when I was chattering about that. Let me go back. Here's the image I was talking about, this one here. You see, it's a large plaza with steps into buildings that have long been destroyed. You have a main pathway with buildings like a downtown here, and then you have the pyramid to the moon over here to the left. Again, very sophisticated culture, engineering, archaeology, the whole 9 yards. These names are often spelled differently. It's the same problem. It's non-alphabetic. This all comes out of the deciphering of Native American, particularly Mesoamerican hieroglyphics. And hieroglyphics, as we know from ancient Egypt, is the using of symbols, pictures, animals, symbolic kind of jottings, etc., that are meant to convey a message. And for the longest time, these were not decipherable. But it's an area of American history that is really growing, because more and more of the hieroglyphics are being interpreted, and you're starting to get an actual history with exact chronological dates, etc. It's the Teotihuacan is the site of the most significant Mesoamerican pyramids. They were far enough away that they didn't get destroyed. Some of the biggest ones, the Spanish destroyed because they were places for human sacrifice, and so they were doing their duty as they saw it in destroying these pagan places. Thought to have been established about 100 BCE and under construction for about 350 years. Somewhere around 550 of the Common Era, it was sacked and burned. It's questioned whether it was the center of a state empire or not, but again, its architectural influence was felt throughout Mesoamerica. Next comes to, and this group, more is known about them in that their writings have been deciphered, and therefore there's now a chronological history. And like this here is a great, well-preserved temple, a pyramid, and then here at the top is where they sacrificed their human victims as they went up. I don't think it would be any fun to climb up this thing, but evidently the Maya didn't have any trouble doing it. See if there's anything else in here we want to look at. Picture-wise, didn't transfer back to the computer. This is what I was talking about here. This particular period, beautiful, beautiful use of stone. The mathematics are exactly precise. The Mayans were among the most mathematically accurate, even more so than any of the old world cultures. I'm trying to look through here if there's any additional things I want to look at. This one's even steeper. I don't even know how you get up to the top of that. I guess these are the steps here, but man, that doesn't look like it would be any fun, drugged or not, getting to the top of that particular pyramid. Let me see. This right here, this is the Yucatan Peninsula and then down into Guatemala. That is the Mayan heartland. Again, agricultural in nature. The two-crop harvest in a given year, built upon the Olmec and the other pre-existing cultures, but also evolving and developing in its own unique kind of way. Again, this is the maximum extent of Mayan civilization here. The Yucatan, bordering up here into southern Mexico and down here into Guatemala. Again, not huge areas, but a significant population, certainly a significant culture. Here's a breakdown, and as I said, these exact dates are starting to evolve as the hieroglyphics are deciphered more and more over the years. The Maya collapse, okay. There are a lot of theories about it, but again, it's probably a combination of things. Warfare. The Mayan, and they were city-states. It wasn't a gigantic culture. And as we've known, when you have city-states adjacent to one another, they tend to go to war with one another. And it's this. People are getting killed in the war, but also these are cultures that offer human sacrifice. And they don't offer up necessarily their enemies captured in battle. They offer their own. So you have a depletion there. You also have soil depletion. It's a slash and burn agriculture. So they're chopping the jungle down, chopping it down, burning it, etc. And I've talked to people who've been down in this area, and they say it's absolutely amazing. You'll be standing on a farm that looks like just like something out of Middle America, and right across the fence you get into the rainforest. What is somewhat speculated is that as more and more land came under cultivation, the rainforest disappeared to a large extent, only to regrow itself after the demise of the Maya. And then the third possibility, and it's probably a combination of all of these things, natural disaster. We all saw what happened in New Orleans with the hurricane down there and the difficulty people had of surviving that natural disaster. But, there's cars, boats, buses, trains, helicopters, all sorts of things, and most of the people that got trapped did survive. If you're in the Yucatan Peninsula and you get hit by a hurricane or maybe a couple of them back to back, there's nobody to fly in supplies. There's nobody to come to the rescue. And unless you're up on the high ground, you're going to have a hard time surviving. And so the guess is that a combination of these things, the internal practices, the wearing out of the soil, by planting the same crops over and over again in the same place. And the big crop was maize, corn, which is one of the major contributions of Native American culture, the New World culture, to the Old. And then the last of these Mesoamerican cultures I'm going to go over are the Aztecs. Again, you see here, this is the pyramid. This culture started with the Olmecs. The Aztecs, we're talking 1500 of the Common Era. So this is 2,000 years of the culture. You can see they're more sophisticated, more refined, but they're still the same sort of pyramid, and they serve the same function and the same purpose. Here's a ceramic sculpture of Aztec warrior. And the Aztecs put together the largest of the Mesoamerican cultures at that particular time. Here it is. Tenochtitlan is their capital here in the center. The legend was that they roamed, and when they saw an eagle with a snake in its mouth sitting in a cactus, that's where the gods wanted them to settle, and they said that's what happened here at Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, and that is why that image is on the Mexican flag, if you look closely enough in it. And so this is the Aztec Empire. It stretched from the Gulf to the Pacific Ocean. This is the area they directly controlled, and then they had tributary states around them. That is, give us gold, silver, give us crops, etc., and we won't mess with you too much. The Aztec Empire was about 10 million in it, and the guy that is responsible for the European conquest, Cortez, ran into what was called the Triple Alliance, of which the Aztecs were ahead. Let me see here. Cortez, Hernan Cortez. I didn't go back to the computer. I'm sorry, guys. I keep doing that. Usually when I have a class here, they remind me when I do that. So, now let me go back up here quickly. Here's the Aztec pyramids, a very well-preserved one. Again, it was for ritual sacrifice. Here's the rather large ceramic sculpture. Amazingly survived intact, given that it's ceramic. Didn't break over time. Again, very sophisticated, well-developed culture, peace and prosperity. This is the Aztec Empire, the large empire going from the Gulf all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And then you have one Hernan Cortez, who, you know, if he were alive today, I would advise him, guy, just go out and buy lottery tickets, because he was one of the luckiest guys in the history of the world. And here he is. There's a portrait of Cortez in his later years, as was often the case. Just as in the Crusades, he was a member of the lesser nobility. Why did he come to seek his fortune in the Americas? He was a younger son. He wasn't going to inherit anything. So this lesser nobility, the hidalgos as they were called by the Spanish, came to the New World seeking his fame and fortune. He landed on the coast of Mexico here in 1519, and this is how audacious this guy is. He then ordered his ships burned so that none of his band of 500 men could desert. They had to stick with him to the end. So here you go. You got 500 Spaniards versus 10 million Aztecs. Now you're going to say, there's no way in the world that Cortez is going to be able to defeat this 10 million person empire. Well, what happens is he happens to fulfill a prophecy that the Aztec head, the chief, if you will, comes down to us as Montezuma, properly pronounced as Montezuma. But at any rate, there's an Aztec prophecy that said a white god from the east would land, and it might be a good or a bad omen. And boom, here comes Cortez, and he fits the image of it. Furthermore, they're wearing armor, and they're riding horses, which are completely unknown. And the horses have armor on them. So for a while, they even thought the horse and men were one animal, until later that was figured out to not be the case, particularly even after both the horses and the men took off their armor. But the other advantage that Cortez ran into is that one of the tribes that were tributary to the Aztecs that didn't particularly like them a woman named Malinche. And she was of use within her own tribe because she could speak a number of the different tribal languages. Cortez runs into her early on. They become an item. And she very quickly, she's a linguist. She learns how to speak Spanish. And she becomes his chief translator. And as Cortez roams around here, he roams around the coast, and then he starts to head inland with the help of Malinche. And as he gets to his first stop, Montezuma has sent Cortez two gifts that he thought would placate this god from the east. One is, about a 12 inch in diameter, maybe larger, plate of silver, and another one the same size of gold. And this is symbolic that he is the god of the sun and the moon here for the Aztecs, and he thought this would be something that would make Cortez happy. Well, it did make Cortez happy, but it made him want more gold and silver. And so he proceeded apace. This is the path that he followed here. And what he's doing on this rather circuitous path, he's picking up allies. He found out from Malinche that a lot of these tribes didn't like the Aztecs because, again, the Aztecs were a little bit unlike the Mayas. They offered human sacrifice, but they didn't sacrifice themselves. They went out into the hinterlands and picked up people on the outskirts, brought them back to Tenochtitlan, and used them for sacrifice. Now, Tenochtitlan is present-day Mexico City, and this lake here has been almost entirely filled in. So Mexico City sits on very unstable ground, filled-in lake on top of a place where there's an earthquake fault. It's one of those places in the world where if there's an earthquake, it's going to be a major, major disaster. But Cortez finally finds his way to Tenochtitlan, and they are stunned. It's one of the largest cities in the world. Montezuma may have been he certainly was among the wealthiest people in the world, might have been the wealthiest person in the world with the gold and silver that he had acquired there. And Cortez is there. He's welcome in the palace. And then as he's moved into the palace, he and his soldiers basically put Montezuma under house arrest. Now, the problem with both the Aztecs and then later the Incas is that it's a very top-down society. There's no, vice president, and there's no chain of command. You've got the top guy, and if the top guy isn't there giving orders, nobody really can take action on their own. And so the Spanish kind of figured this out and make Montezuma a prisoner in his own palace. The Spaniards then roam around Mexico City looking for gold and silver, and there comes to be a problem after a month or so, in that they start to observe these human sacrifices. And the human sacrifices were ordered by Montezuma's younger brother, who was offering blood to the gods to try to get him to get the Spanish to leave. Well, the Spanish, being Christian soldiers, interfere. They stop the sacrifice, and there's a riot in the streets as the Aztec followers and believers attack the Spanish soldiers, who then flee back to Montezuma's palace, where they're able to hide out and escape further damage. Now, this is the other thing, is that besides bringing the soldiers and disease, the other thing that the Spanish brought were missionaries. And all along the way, they attempted to convert Native Americans to Christianity, and it's not a hard sell, particularly when you contrast it with the idea of a religion that requires human sacrifice and so on. Get baptized, follow the sacraments, live a good life. When you die, you go to heaven. Pretty good deal. And so conversion to Christianity, either complete or partial, was a common characteristic. Long story short, after they get there, this is Cortez destroying his fleet so that his soldiers would not flee when they were badly outnumbered. And he gets to Tenochtitlan, and this is Cortez and Malinche talking to the various Native American leaders here. It's a pretty good depiction. I hadn't seen that one before. And so what happens with Cortez is, as his soldiers and he are surrounded at the palace, they murder Montezuma, and then they take all the gold and silver that they can get their hands on, and they flee in the night. They are detected by the Aztecs, and the Aztecs begin to chase them. They do get across the causeway because the palace was on an island. Palace was on an island in the middle of the lake that was there. A couple men loaded down with all their gold fell into the lake and drowned. But most of Cortez's men got away. They escaped to the tribes that were tributary to the Aztecs. And they're kind of scared about this because the Aztecs had already defeated them in war. But Cortez is able to rally the troops, and then with his remaining Spaniards and his Native American allies, they turn around and attack Tenochtitlan. Now again, it's 500 Spaniards and maybe a few thousand Native Americans against 10 million Aztecs. What the heck happens? Well, when they get there, it is brutal building to building, hand to hand kind of combat that takes place. Let's see if there are any photos here. And it doesn't seem to be going well. But then as the siege wears on, they come to see that the resistance is less and less and less. That there's still fighting going on, but the resistance is less organized and less intense. And what simply happened was smallpox. One of the diseases that the Europeans brought with them was smallpox. The Aztecs had no immunities to smallpox. And Cortez lands in 1519. There's 10 million Aztecs. 1600, there's a million left. Who survives? Those who have immunities. About 10% of the population survives. Furthermore, Cortez's allies suffer the same problem. They die from the disease. And so there's no resistance. That's the good news for the Spanish. The bad news for the Spanish, there's nobody to do the work. And again, this shortage of labor that Native Americans failed to fill because of their vulnerability to disease and then their subsequent low numbers leads to the importation of African slave labor. Less so in Mexico than in most places because more of the population ended up surviving for one reason or another, and they become, in effect, the slave labor force for the Spanish. But by and large, throughout the Caribbean, Central America, South America, it becomes African slave labor becomes the labor force of choice. Okay, I have a few more to go through here. This is one of the oldest known of the pre-Columbian cultures. This is the Chavin culture. Goes from southern Ecuador all the way down the coast of Peru into northern Chile. It occupies the coastal area there, and that's because of the geography of the area, of the Andes Mountains. It's kind of an interesting. This is the Andes Mountains. They are the second largest of the mountain chains after the Himalayas, and they, in some places, they come right down to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. But in most places, it's back. You have a coastal plain, which allows for farming. And again, this is one of their large castles that they settled in. This doesn't show as clearly the agricultural setup, but it's very interesting in how they developed and evolved as a culture. Let me look here. Oh, this is interesting. This is where one of the myth of ancient aliens come from. These cultures did these gigantic glyphs that are symbolic, that are only visible from the air. So again, producing this is pretty sophisticated. And in the whole alien culture, alien invasion and assistance with these things, it's kind of the result of not giving the indigenous population enough credit for being able to do this kind of sophisticated artwork and engineering. Needless to say, I'm not a fan of the ancient aliens theory of petroglyphs and geoglyphs that take place. Okay, Moche is another one of those. See, what I'm looking for is, I'm now going to go there. What I was looking for was the terraces that they use for agriculture. Another one of the groups in Chavin, let me see, is this. Okay, it's described as a pre-literate civilization. That is, there wasn't any real written record, and that's why there's not much on them, in that they didn't leave a written record. But again, pretty sophisticated in the way of artwork, mythology, etc. Don't know if there was any human sacrifice involved here, if that was basically a Mesoamerican situation. Here's a ceramic vessel. Again, meant to, you can see there's a handle here, and then here's the spout by which you could pour out the contents, be it water or something else. And these are the Nazca, and here are their geoglyphs. Okay, this is a big, giant bird. Again, you can see it most clearly from above. Here's another one of the glyphs here. I guess this is maybe a monkey that they've drawn lines of. So again, pretty sophisticated cultures that exist that were very much dismissed both by the Spaniards and really, as I said, most of the time until the late 20th century, till more and more excavation has been done on these particular sites. And the Nazca are one of those. This is Nazca today, and I guess this is one. I don't know if this is an ancient geoglyph or it's a modern one there for tourists. Here it is, the Nazca lines. Okay, here's, this is an aqueduct. Okay, it's the way water was gotten out to the fields and watered their particular crops that went in. While you have a fertile land, it's arid, it's dry, you don't have a consistent rain, and therefore you need to have a sophisticated irrigation system. And these are the image of the Wari. The book I have, and I'm going to show you some images from it. They don't spell Wari, H-U-A-R-I. It's spelled W-A-R-Y. Well, here it is right here, spelled in that particular manner. But you can see very sophisticated sculpture, pottery, ceramics, etc., and occupying a larger area here, down from Ecuador along the coast. And the reason they're so narrow is the mountains are right here. And what's crazy is after you get over this high mountain range, on the other side is the rainforest. So you have huge difference in climate and culture between these two areas that exist side by side. The Wari expanded that territory. They're one of the larger groups in the South American area. Not much is known about the rainforest area because this is where the Spanish settled, because that's where the gold and silver was. So what I'll do is switch over here to the document camera. And here is an example of Wari sculpture. This is from, I bought the book, there was an exhibit of Wari art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and so I bought this book so that I could share it with one of my classes at some point down the line, and I have done that over the years. Here's a very elaborate ceramic bowl, and you know, with the typical art imagery that you associate with Native American culture. I don't pretend to know what all those symbols stand for, but they do have religious, cultural meaning behind them. The other thing that the Wari were very good at was textiles. You live in that area, it gets cold as you move up into the mountainous areas, and this is an example of very sophisticated textile designs and just textiles in general. Here's another one. Kind of looks like abstract art. Looks like something from the abstract expressionist school of painting. And I just love these statues. These ceramic things. They're very creative in terms of what they do, and they almost, and to some extent, look modern in the way they jump out at you. At least they do to me. Here's another ceramic piece. This has got a three-dimensional element to it. It's not just a functional piece. You've got this face that kind of sticks out from the vase, making it almost a 3D piece of artwork. This is a map. This is the moche, and I'm not going to focus on that too much. Here's a few more pieces of sculpture. Another one here. This again, you got the handles here on the side, and then you got the pour there. This is a leftover site. You can see it's a small village, and you can see it's kind of arid and dry here, and that necessitates a very sophisticated irrigation system that they were able to produce. Here's an aerial view of one of the cities of the Wari. And then this is, again, a circle, probably used for religious purposes, but again, indicative of a very sophisticated culture. This is a little different. It's not ceramic. It's a woven. It's a weaving, reeds, grasses, etc. Again, dyed and colored in a pretty sophisticated manner there. So I just wanted to go through the Wari. Here's more of the designs. I'm not going to go page by page through the book, but I like it, and it gives you an idea, again, of a very sophisticated culture that existed before the arrival of the Spanish. And then what I'll finally go through here are the ancient Incas. They are the last of the major Native American cultures that were conquered and destroyed by the Spanish. Here's a gigantic statue that was carved for religious purposes there. Nope, I thought there was an image, it must be further in here. Okay, this is an example. This is an Inca cultural civilization, but you can see here you've got a small river, you got mountains right here, and then you just got a small field on which you can grow things. But if you look over here on this side, what they do is they take the slopes of the mountain and level them off, and it's kind of terraced as you go up, making more land arable and available for agriculture and farming. As you go further up, it gets colder and colder, but as with Mesoamerica, the finding was not maize there. What the crop that proved to be useful for Europeans was potatoes, and a variety of different potatoes, not just the Idaho and Maine potatoes we get, but blue ones and things of another nature. Here is the llama, the only Native American animal. You can't see it very well. Let me move this book around a little bit. The llama. It's the only Native American animal, that and an alpaca, that was domesticated. They were the beasts of burden for Native Americans, also a source of wool. And then here is the sacred animal of all the Native American cultures from Mesoamerica all the way down into Peru, and that is the jaguar. Down here Again, you can see very narrow roadway, but this is a road created by the Incas. This is a wall, and then you have the village there. This is all pre-Columbian in terms of its age and development. Let me look here. Oh, these are two photos, and then I'll get up and move. This is again an irrigation system where water came down here and then into this ditch and watered. And this is a great example right here of terracing, where this was at one time a slope that went up, and they just chopped it off and leveled it off into these terraces so they could use it for agricultural purposes. Pretty sophisticated work. So, go back to the computer here, and we'll go to the Inca. Then I'll go back, show you a few more pictures, and then we'll be done. Okay. These are among my favorite photos of the Inca. This is Machu Picchu. And it's way up in the Andes Mountains. And here's the amazing thing about Machu Picchu. It's a major Inca civilization or city, shrine, whatever you want to call it. No European reported it or probably had seen it until 1910. It's that high up and that difficult to get to. It's one of the places I'd like to get to before I move along to the next world, but as time is going on, it seems less and less likely that we'll be able to do that. But here are a series of images of this gigantic city up about 12,000 feet. And they have found that they don't take tourists right up there because they need time to acclimate to the altitude. And so they take them to different villages on buses, 5,000 feet, 7,000 feet, 9,000, and finally they take them up to Machu Picchu. But again, all this stuff is built up in the mountains, all done by hand without any major kind of tools. This is a great photo here. It shows the clouds interacting. The other thing they have done, the Peruvian government has to have guards there because tourists kept taking rocks and pieces away from there, and pretty soon there wouldn't be any Machu Picchu left. Same thing happens in Italy with Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius and Herculaneum. They have to keep an eye on tourists all the time to keep them from walking off with bits and pieces of it. Again, here's another, it almost looks like a Greek, it almost looks like the Parthenon here, this structure here. I just would think it would be very, very fascinating to visit all this, and you then have these gigantic mountains behind it. Again, my point being, these were very sophisticated, organized cultures, and not something that was just waiting to be quote-unquote civilized. Okay, now you can see here, we started talking out about the Chavin culture, then the Nazca, then the Wari. The Incas, they were all the way up here into Ecuador, all the way down the coast of Peru, all the way down here into modern-day Chile. And they had it connected by a road system. The road system had mileposts, about a mile apart. And the messages were carried by individuals, and you would run that 1 mile as fast as you could. You would verbally pass that message on to the next person, who would run their 1 mile, to the next person, to the next, and it was something like 2,100 miles long, and was probably the fastest communication system in the world up to that time. It was also, if you were a messenger, you had better not mess up, because they would occasionally give tests. They would give a fake message, and if the message got garbled somewhere along the way, you were kicked out and subject to punishment for that. So again, you've got this elaborate road system and communication system, and when the two protagonists, Pizarro, the Spaniard, and Atahualpa. And it's the same deal. It's a top-down society. Once you capture the leader, which Pizarro was aware of from Cortez's experience, that there's going to be difficulty in fighting you. And here is Atahualpa, the last leader of the Inca Empire, as he was executed by the Spanish here. Notice the priest praying, the soldiers there, Pizarro over here as well. Atahualpa asked for a truce as the Spanish came marching in, and Pizarro agrees to meet him, and they decide to come under flags of truce. Evidently there are translators there, and they're going to meet in the square. And Atahualpa walks out. He's going to give greetings to Pizarro, and Pizarro says as soon as he arrives and is about to touch me, he had his soldiers on horseback hiding in the alleyways and streets in Cusco. That was the city. And they came storming out. They capture Atahualpa and go riding off. And then as they take Atahualpa to his palace, he said, what do you want? He said, I want gold and silver. And he said, well, if you fill this room up over here to this mark with silver, and then you go to the next room, fill this room up with gold, I'll let you go. Well, sure enough, Atahualpa sends the word out, and they fill up the two rooms with gold and silver, and now the Spanish are wealthier beyond all means. And then, in true justice, boom, they strangle Atahualpa, and they take over, and now that becomes the Spanish Empire there in Latin America. So, it's a sad tale, to be sure, historically, but the Native Americans, for all intents and purposes, were doomed. It wasn't certainly the treachery of the Spanish. The Europeans who arrived was pretty much unmatched, but it was the inability to resist disease, and the Incas fell victim to the same problem as the Aztecs did. The more they came in contact with the Spanish, the more of them that died, and then the more that were brought in. The Spanish were able to come in and take over this huge, gigantic empire, and that's what I'll leave you with here. And here's the Spanish Empire as they took over Florida to California, as far north as the Dakotas, all the way down to Chile here. This is the source of Spanish wealth. They were the gold and silver they were looking for, and their exploration of the Americas was they were looking for the same thing. The English kept looking for it, but all the gold and silver was where the Spaniards were. This little area here is Portugal, and we'll talk about the Age of Discovery a couple chapters down the road. Okay, let me just look through the text and make sure I haven't skipped anything that you need to know. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and the next thing I'll go to is we'll go to sub-Saharan Africa and do that lecture then. And that is where this chapter on the Native Americans and the chapter on, you can see I didn't have the computer on again. Here's the Spanish Empire in North America, South America. This is the Portuguese Empire here. And if you notice the close proximity of Africa to Brazil, and the largest number of African slaves out of 14 million, 8 million ended up here in Brazil. It's a much shorter distance, and the Portuguese had early access. But the other 6 million centered here in the Caribbean islands, northern part of South America, Central America, not so much in Mexico, and about 250,000 into English America. And we'll talk about that later on as well. Okay, with that, I'll end this, and we'll pick up on sub-Saharan Africa the next lecture. Okie doke.